There's a lot of Swedish words and city names in the opening of this story, so just bear with me as I butcher all of those.
Why didn't you look up how to pronounce them?
Because it's more fun for me to just butcher them. Benny Andersson, which is probably the easiest name that I'll get in this whole story, was born in 1946 in Stockholm, Sweden. His dad was a civil engineer, and both his father and his grandfather really enjoyed playing the accordion, and Benny got his own at the age of 6 and started to learn how to play it. As a kid, he discovered Elvis and wanted to start playing in rock bands, but his father and his grandfather had taught him how to play folk songs. Benny decided not to follow his father into the construction business, and he quit his job as a custodian to play piano for a Swedish pop group called the Hepstars in 1964. The Hepstars actually became one of the biggest acts in Sweden. They were eventually known as the Swedish Beatles. In March of 1965, the Hepstars had their first hit with a song called Cadillac, but they mostly played cover songs of international hits. All in all, the group had 15 chart hits in Sweden, including a song that Benny wrote. But it was the studio recording time that really piqued Benny's interest. By the end of the 60s, things were rough for the Hepstars. Their management organization didn't do a great job with the financials, and Sweden's economy was in a tough spot anyway, so the band started trying to navigate toward a wider audience. They brought in an American singer, which meant that they kicked out the old singer. In 1966, Benny met a singer named, Bjorn Ulvaeus, and had started to write songs with him. For a while, Bjorn stepped in to replace the Hepstar singer, but eventually the group just decided to call it quits and went their separate ways.
What happened to the American guy?
I think it might have been a female, actually, but I don't know. It just didn't really work out, so they moved on. Bjorn Ulvaeus was born in Gothenburg, Sweden in 1945. As a teenager, he fell in love with rock and roll and skiffle. By the early 60s, he was in a folk group called the West Bay Singers. The group entered a talent competition put on by a radio station, which brought them to the attention of a songwriter and publisher named Stig Andersson. Stig had recently started a record company, and he signed the group. But during that signing process, they changed their name to the Hootenanny Singers.
Hell yeah. That's a band name.
The Hootenanny Singers became one of the biggest acts in Sweden during the 60s, and, as you might expect, they ran into the Hepstars while touring. That's how Bjorn and Benny started hanging out and wanting to work together. Stig Andersson saw the potential in their collaboration and encouraged them to write more together. So by the end of the 60s, Benny was out of the Hepstars, and the Hootenanny Singers only existed as a recording band. They weren't touring. So they both started to really focus on their writing and producing partnership under Stig's label. In 1969, they started to have their first real hits with a song recorded by the Hepstars and one recorded by Britta Borg, which was called, Ljuva Sextiotal, which is Swedish for sweet 60s.
Is it?
Apparently. Also, in 1969, Benny submitted a song that he wrote to a Eurovision Song Festival. Through that competition, he met Annifrid Lingstad, better known as Frida.
Oh, okay.
Frida was born in Bjorkesen, it's a small village in northern Norway. Her mother was Norwegian, and her father was a German sergeant in the Nazi army. They met during the German occupation of Norway, and after the war, he would go back to Germany. Frida's mother and grandmother left their Norwegian village because they were afraid of the people who had less than pleasant feelings toward the Nazi soldiers. They settled in Sweden, where her mother soon passed away from kidney failure at the age of 21.
Holy cow!
Leaving Frida to be mainly raised by her grandmother. Frida always believed that her father died on his way back to Germany when his ship was sunk. But when a magazine published all of the details of her early life, her half-brother saw that and asked his dad about it. So, a few months after that, Frida got to meet her dad for the first time in Stockholm in 1977. Frida said that her grandmother often sang folk songs to her, and Frida soon came to be known around their small town for her great voice. She'd be asked to sing for their school on Fridays. I don't know why Fridays, just...
casual Fridays.
Yeah. At the age of 13,
just sing.
At the age of 13, she got her first job singing for a dance band. The band leader said about her, quote, "It was hard to believe such a young person could sing that well. She was so easy to rehearse with, and she was never shy on stage. The only thing I taught her was to sing out. In those days, she had a tendency of holding back her voice a little, end quote. Through the 60s, she joined or started a few other big bands, all of which included her husband, Ragnar.
Why aren't you named Ragnar? You have a boring name. Your name is Nicholas.
Excuse me.
Why couldn't you be Ragnar? We could be Mika and Ragnar. No one would want to be our friends.
No one would expect we are just like boring Tennessee white people named Mika and Ragnar. In 1967, Frida won a Swedish talent competition arranged by a record company. The prize was a recording contract with EMI's Swedish subsidiary label. She was also supposed to sing her winning song live on Sweden's most popular TV show, but that performance also happened to be on the same day that Sweden switched from driving on the left-hand side to the right-hand side of the road. Because of that, driving was very much discouraged on that day to avoid all of the confusion, so most people were at home watching her sing her song on the television. So her performance caused a sensation, and there was a rush to sign her, but EMI got there first.
Because they were driving on the correct side of the road, they didn't get hit.
Around this time, she was separated from her husband Ragnar. After meeting once in the song contest, Frida ran into Benny and Bjorn at a restaurant. They all went back to Benny's to hang out, and Frida left saying that she felt like she had known Benny her whole life. The two would start dating, and by 1971 were living together, while Frida continued to work as a solo singer and playing cabarets and clubs across Sweden. Benny produced her solo debut album, which was just called Frida, and one of the songs that hit number 1 featured all 4 members of ABBA, because at that time, Bjorn had already married Agnetha Faltskog. Thanks to Benny and Bjorn's partnership, the two couples were already really good friends. Agnetha was born in Jönköping. Anyway, she was born in Sweden in 1950. Her father was a department store manager who had a massive interest in music and show business. By the age of 6, she had already written her first song, and by the age of 8, she had started taking piano lessons for the first time. At 10, she formed a musical trio with her friends called the Cambers. By the age of 15, she decided to leave school and pursue a career in music. She started to perform with a local dance band for a few years. During that time, she broke up with her boyfriend, which inspired a song that brought her some level of recognition in Sweden. One of her band members' relatives retired from his rock and roll career and started working at a local label. So that band member sent him a demo tape. After hearing it, he was only interested in Agnetha and her song. So she left the band to sign a recording contract. Her debut single, Jagavar Sakar, topped the Swedish charts in 1968 and sold over 80,000 copies. Through the late 60s, she continued to see success as a solo artist. She got engaged to a German producer who got her some fame in Germany and promised she would be a star there. But when she went there, she said the material they gave her was, quote, horrible. So she turned them down. Eventually, she ended the engagement and returned to Sweden. She would perform on the same TV special with Bjorn, and they would start dating, eventually getting married in 1971. The two couples continued with what they were doing separately, routinely appearing on each other's records and collaborating together. So I guess it came about pretty naturally that they would try a project together. In 1972, they released the first ABBA song, even though they weren't yet called ABBA. Or ABBA, I don't know. Is it ABBA or ABBA?
I think it's ABBA, technically.
Okay. All right. That song would eventually hit number 1 in Sweden for 15 weeks.
I'm like...
You're questioning
myself. How do you do ABBA? 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 I don't know. Shoot.
I think it just depends on what you want. I don't think it has an actual meaning.
I think it does. It's got to be whatever they say, right?
In 1973, they entered the Eurovision Song Contest, which is a European song contest. So the way Eurovision works is each country submits one song to be played on live TV.
Wow.
Then people will cast votes to determine a winner. The song that this group submitted, the group subsequently known as ABBA, submitted, placed 3rd in Sweden that year. So they did not get through to the finals with every other country.
Wow.
But they still released an album together, still basically without a name. Stig, who was now their manager, was tired of not having a name for them. So he ran a contest where people could submit names. But the rumors are that Stig ignored all of those submitted names and announced that they'd be named ABBA, which he had already started calling them behind the scenes. The name is an acronym of their names. It's also the name of a popular fish canning company in Sweden. So they had to negotiate for the name with the canning company, who only allowed them to use it, quote, if they didn't make them embarrassed to have the same name, end quote. Stig thought they needed a UK or US hit to be successful and thought ABBA was a name that could work well in England and America. In 1974, they entered Eurovision again with a song called Waterloo.
I know that one.
This time, they got through to the finals, which were held in Brighton, England, and ended up winning the entire competition. Soon after their finals performance, the song hit number 1 all over Europe and even entered the top 10 in the US, who really couldn't care less about Eurovision. After this success, they went on to tour through Europe, but it wasn't as expected. Throughout Europe, they had pretty poor turnout and even had to cancel a few shows in Switzerland because no one wanted to come. But in Scandinavia, they played to packed houses everywhere they went. Part of that has to do with the stigma of winning Eurovision. Winners are often seen as one-hit wonders, and it's really hard to follow that one song up with another that proves you are like actually artists. They also were pretty new and trying to figure out what kind of band they actually wanted to be. Bjorn later said, quote, if you look at the singles we released right after Waterloo, we were trying to be more like The Sweet, a semi-glam rock group, which was stupid because we were always a pop group. End quote.
Yeah.
In 1974 and 1975, they released several follow-up singles that failed to chart in the UK. But in 1975, they reached the top again with their third album, which was just called ABBA. Their first single, SOS, was a massive hit in the US and the UK. The album hit the top 10, and the second single, Mamma Mia, is still a hit. They capitalized on the emerging medium of the music video to showcase the group's natural chemistry and charisma, which helped the album be successful globally. It's also worth noting that Stig Anderson, their manager, was helping to write a lot of these early singles. 1976 really saw the start of their superstar era. They released a greatest hits album, which feels a little premature.
It's a little early.
Which became their first number 1 album in the UK and eventually sold 1 million copies in the US. It included a new single called Fernando, which went to number 1 in 13 countries.
It's awesome.
It held the number 1 spot in Australia for 14 weeks, which was a record until Ed Sheeran broke it with Shape of You. Their fourth studio album, called Arrival, showcased more of their ability as musicians. It featured more accomplishment and skill in both songwriting and producing than they had ever really shown before. And it was another smash hit, even getting rave reviews in more rock-oriented magazines. The album's success was largely driven by the lead single, which was released before the album, and it was arguably their biggest song ever and their only number 1 in the US, which is wild.
The only number 1?
The only number 1 in the US, and it is Dancing Queen. Apparently, Frida cried the first time that Benny played her the backing track, and Agnetha said, quote, it's often difficult to know what will be a hit. The exception was Dancing Queen. We all knew it was going to be massive, end quote. In 1977, they started another European tour, this time selling out venues everywhere they played. When they played in London at the Royal Albert Hall, tickets were only available to people who mailed in an application to buy them. The box office received 3.5 million requests for tickets.
That's awesome.
Which was enough to fill the venue 850 times.
Holy cow.
The next few singles from the album Arrival also hit number 1 in many European countries. They were massively popular all over the world, especially in Australia, but their success in the US never quite measured up to what it was in Europe. When they toured Australia in 1977, they used the footage to make ABBA the movie. Agnetha, because of her blonde hair, was usually seen as the group's pin-up girl, which she hated. For that Australia show, she performed in a skin-tight white jumpsuit, which one reviewer commented on, saying that, quote, Agnetha's bottom tops dull show, end quote.
Yikes.
To which Agnetha replied, don't they have bottoms in Australia? End
Queen.
quote.
Queen.
They released an ambitious album to coincide with the movie called simply ABBA the Album. It did pretty well on the back of big singles like Take a Chance on Me. By 1978, they were one of the biggest bands in the world, with major singles charting all over the world. They converted an old movie theater in Stockholm into a state-of-the-art music studio, which was used by other major bands like Genesis and Led Zeppelin. Also in 1978, Benny and Frida finally got married after more than 9 years as a couple. But by 1979, cracks were starting to show. In January of 1979, Agnetha and Bjorn announced that they were getting a divorce. Benny said about the divorce, quote, "In many ways, Agnetha and my divorce was an amicable one. We just grew apart and decided let's split up," end quote. But things might not have been that easy. Agnetha said that she needed therapy after their divorce, exasperated by the fact that Bjorn had a new girlfriend within like a week of their split. Probably understandably, people thought this was the end of ABBA, but they assured people that they were not done making music. They even said that the split took some stress off of their working partnership. However, it did hurt their image as happy couples making music together, which was kind of their brand. In 1980, they released an album called Super Troopers, which featured a few songs with more melancholy sounds and lyrics. Here's one of those songs, which is probably my favorite ABBA song, called The Winner Takes It All, which features Agnetha singing the lyrics, "Tell me, does she kiss like I used to kiss you? Does it feel the same when she calls your name?" In January of 1981, Bjorn got married again to a girl named Lena. Also, Benny and Frida announced that they were also getting a divorce. They had separated in 1980 and divorced in 1981 after Benny told Frida that he had found someone else. He would eventually marry a TV presenter named Nora later that same year. Again, they assured the public that the divorce would not affect their work as ABBA, and they'd continue making music together. In 1981, they released The Visitors, which was their 8th studio album. Although it still did really well by most standards, it was not super commercially successful by ABBA standards. By 1982, the energy was starting to seep out of the group. Benny and Bjorn were hard at work on a musical called Chess. Frida and Agnetha were busy relaunching their solo careers. In May and June of 1982, the group got together for initial songwriting and recording sessions, but they weren't really sure what they were planning on doing. They talked about a new album, maybe a short tour, but ultimately the sessions were difficult and unproductive. They only got 3 songs out of it, but the group wasn't happy with them, so the tapes were shelved and they took a break for the summer. They'd end up releasing another compilation album, but they would not record another album of new music. At the end of 1982, they decided they were not going to continue on as a group, arguing that they could always get back together after a break if they wanted to. After the breakup, Frida released a solo album produced by Phil Collins. It was a super successful album. She also worked on a children's musical based on ABBA's music called ABBA Cadabra. But for the most part, Frida kind of stepped back from the public sphere. She sang on a few different tracks, but mostly just kind of like stayed in the background. Agnetha released her first post-ABBA solo album in 1983, which was also a huge success. For the rest of the 80s, she continued her solo career to pretty great success by any standard other than ABBA's success. After her 4th post-ABBA album in 1988, she decided to take a break and kind of disappeared from the public eye for 17 years. She made few public appearances and spent most of her time practicing yoga and horse riding at her secluded ranch near Stockholm.
That sounds lovely.
In the mid-90s, her mother committed suicide, and her father died a year later, which increased her struggles with depression. In 1997, she started a relationship with a forklift driver, but when she broke it off, he started to stalk her, which resulted in him getting deported to the Netherlands.
Bored.
In 2004, she returned to music with a new single that was really successful. Benny and Bjorn continue to work together on various projects, including composing the music for Mamma Mia, a musical based on ABBA songs. They've also worked on various ABBA compilations and re-releases. Benny admitted to abusing alcohol most of his life, but he got sober in 2001 and has remained so since.
Congratulations, Benny.
In May of 2013, Agnetha said that a reunion would never happen. She said, quote, "I think we have to accept that it will not happen, because we are too old and each one of us has their own life. Too many years have gone by since we stopped, and there's really no meaning in putting us together again." But she stressed that the band was on amicable terms, saying, "It's always nice to see each other now and then, and to talk a little and be a little nostalgic." But then, in 2014, she said she'd love to record a few new songs, but it's up to Bjorn and Benny. In 2018, they announced that they recorded 2 new songs for a TV special later that year, but that was delayed as they worked on a new project that they called Avatars, or Avatars. See, it sounds like they want to say ABBA, because Avatars, ABBA Cadabra, like it sounds like they want it to be pronounced ABBA.
It kind of does.
That project would be a tour of them as avatars. In November of 2021, after a major social media marketing campaign, they released ABBA Voyage. That was their first album in 40 years. They had said that Voyage would be the last ABBA album ever, but they've hedged on that since. Frida has said, quote, "Don't be too sure," end quote. That is the last album. And Benny said that if the girls twist his arm, he can be convinced to do it again. But in May of 2022, Benny said that nothing will happen after this.